The air of the Black Hills in August was a confidence man. It sold warmth the way a stranger sells land, with a handshake, a smile, and no intention of delivering on the deed. The pines held their fragrance close in the heat. The granite boulders radiated a slow amber warmth well past sundown, and the sky ran an unbroken blue from one edge of the world to the other. It was the kind of beauty that made a person careless, made them forget the fundamental truth of this territory, that what August gave January would take back with interest, and it would not apologize for the transaction. Mara Holt was not careless. She had not been careless in a long time. She stood at the edge of the cabin's shallow porch and looked not at the beauty around her, but at the structure behind her. She ran her gaze along the base of the cabin, the way a doctor runs a hand along a patient's ribs, feeling for the break, for the thing that was wrong beneath the surface. The logs themselves were massive, cut from old-growth pine by men who believed that size was a substitute for craftsmanship. The logs were not wrong. What held them together was the chinking, the mixture of mud-dried grass and river clay, packed into every gap between the logs, had gone the color of old bone and the texture of crumbling bread. In places it had fallen out entirely, and she could see narrow seams of pale light showing through from the outside world. Not one or two seams, a dozen she could count from where she stood, and she was not yet inside where the morning light would make them visible as a constellation of failures. She pressed the tip of her finger into the chinking near the door frame. It did not resist. It powdered, and a small shower of grey dust fell onto her boot. Owen came around the side of the cabin, dragging a length of rope behind him, his dark hair pushed flat on one side from sleep, his expression carrying that particular gravity of young children who have decided something is very serious. He was 7, and he looked older in the way that children do when they have spent a year watching a parent grieve and work and grieve again. He stopped when he saw her face. His voice was careful when he asked what it had done. She told him nothing, yet that it was what it was going to do that concerned her. He came to stand beside her and looked at the base of the cabin with the same focused attention she had been giving it, as if he might see what she saw if he looked hard enough. Maybe he did. He had been looking at difficult things alongside her for long enough to have developed an instinct for them. She did not want to frighten him. She also understood with a clarity that had come to her sometime in the months after Caleb died, that protecting Owen from the truth of their situation was a luxury that could kill them both. So she knelt beside him and pointed to one of the visible seams of light. She told him to see where the light came through, and he nodded. She told him that in January that light was going to be wind that was 40 degrees below zero, and the fire was going to try to fight it, and it was going to lose unless they figured something out before the cold arrived. Owen looked at the seam of light for a long time. Then he said that they would figure something out, and he said it the way Caleb used to say things, not as bravado, not to comfort her, but as a simple statement of the next logical step in a world where problems were real and required real answers. She put her hand on the top of his head and did not trust herself to speak for a moment. The cabin had come to them through the kind of transaction that the frontier specialized in producing, a price too low to be honest, a seller too eager to be trustworthy, and documents that described the land with adjectives that had no business being attached to what she found when she arrived. The deed called it fertile ground. What she found was a shallow strip of workable soil in front of the cabin, and behind it a granite hillside so massive and so old that it had an authority to it, a permanence that made the cabin at its base look like something a child had set down and forgotten. The seller, a man named Pratt, who had the complexion of someone who had recently decided that farming was not for him, had described the granite hill as a liability. Nothing grows on it, nothing to be done with it. Part of the deal, though, all of it is part of the deal. She had not looked at the hill much that first summer. That had been the summer of raw survival, of learning which well held water, of figuring out which neighbors were the kind of people who helped and which were the kind who watched. of getting through the heat with a 7-year-old and a grief so large it had its own weather system, of visiting Caleb's grave on the low-rise east of the property every Sunday and sitting there for an hour, saying things she would not have said in front of anyone else. The loom of winter had been abstract then, a shape on the horizon. Now it was the only shape she saw. The settlement had perhaps 40 families scattered across a 3-mile radius, connected by 2 rutted wagon roads and the social infrastructure of the general store, the church, and the deep human instinct for knowing who among your neighbors was struggling. Mara Holt was known. A widow, 1 child, a patch of mostly rockland, came from somewhere back east. Husband died last winter trying to make a go of it, bless her heart. The bless her heart was not unkind. It was just the way the settlement digested information about people it had already categorized and filed away. Silas Croft had not said bless her heart. Silas Croft did not traffic in such softness. He was the settlement's architect in the most literal sense, having built or overseen the construction of more than half the structures in the area. And he carried this fact in his body like a second skeleton, an extra framework of authority beneath the visible one. He was 51 years old, broad across the shoulders, with a face that outdoor labor and indoor certainty had carved into something that resembled a geographic feature rather than a human expression. He had built his own house first naturally, and it was the finest structure in the settlement with dovetailed corners, a chimney of dressed stone that stood 6 feet clear of the roofline, and a main room that could host the entire congregation of the church on a cold Sunday, which it had done. He was at the general store on the first Tuesday of September, when Hattie Pruitt found him within 4 minutes of his arrival, which was approximately 4 minutes faster than anyone else in the settlement could have managed. She was short, broad, with hair the color of creek sand, and eyes that missed very little, and she delivered information with the brisk efficiency of someone who had decided that the gap between knowing something and saying it was wasted time. She told him she had been by the Holt place the day before. He waited. She told him the widow had less than 2 cord stacked, and she let this sit in the air between them at its full weight. 2 cord was perhaps a third of what an experienced settler would consider the minimum for a Dakota winter. And even that estimate assumed a sound structure and an efficient heating source, neither of which the Holt cabin possessed. Less than 2, she said. She had counted. Croft removed his thumbs from his suspenders. He said she was not stupid, though his tone suggested he was working through why the evidence seemed to contradict this. Maybe she was planning to cut more. Hattie shook her head with the practiced efficiency of someone who had shaken it at many things. Alone, she said, with the boy. She told him Mara was going to be a problem come December, and that he knew it and she knew it. He said she would ask for help before then, but Hattie's expression carried a different read of Mara Holt, and it turned out she was the more accurate forecaster of the two. The realization that changed everything did not come to Mara in a flash of inspiration. It arrived the way most useful things in her life had arrived, through exhaustion, through the back door of despair, because there was nowhere else left to go. It was a Tuesday evening in the second week of August. Owen was asleep. The fire in the enormous hearth was burning the way fires in enormous hearths always burned, magnificently, aggressively, and with a profound indifference to the comfort of the room's occupants. The heat it generated in the immediate airspace before it was genuine, fierce enough to scorch the shins. 4 feet back from the hearth, the air was lukewarm. 8 feet back where Owen slept, it was cool enough that she had put a second blanket on him. And at the base of the back wall where the logs met the floor, she had earlier that day pressed her palm flat and felt the cold coming through the chinking, with the patient, unhurried confidence of something that owned the space and was simply waiting for the current occupants to recognize this. She had a piece of paper on her knee and a stub of pencil in her hand. She was doing arithmetic she did not want to finish because she already knew the shape of the answer. The hearth consumed wood at a rate she had now measured over several evenings. A full cord 128 cubic feet of split wood lasted approximately 16 days at the rate required to keep the room at a survivable temperature. Not comfortable. Survivable. She had, including what she could reasonably cut before the ground froze, something between 1.5 and 2 cord. She did not round up. Rounding up was how people on the frontier miscalculated themselves into graves. 32 days. At the outside, 32 days of viable heat. Dakota winters ran to 90 days at minimum, some years to 110. She sat with that gap, 32 against 90, and felt it the way you feel a diagnosis. Not the shock of it, but the settling weight of it, the way it rearranged everything she had previously considered permanent. She put the pencil down. She looked at the fire. She looked at the hearth, that massive, well-intentioned monument to the wrong idea. And then, because she was out of forward directions to look, she looked behind her at the wall that backed against the granite hillside. Caleb had taught her things in the way that people who love their work naturally teach, without curriculum or intention, through the simple act of talking about what they understood deeply. He had spent 15 years in the coal country of western Pennsylvania, working in mines that ran hundreds of feet below the surface, and the underground had given him a particular understanding of stone and heat that was entirely different from what you learned above ground. Above ground, you fought cold with fire directly, constantly, attritionally. Below ground, the relationship between stone and temperature was something else, a conversation, a long, slow exchange governed by mass and time and the fundamental stubbornness of rock. He had said to her once, sitting on the porch of their Pennsylvania house, his hands still gray at the knuckles from a shift he had washed 3 times, that she should feel the walls down there, deep down. Not cold, he had told her. Even in January, 300 feet down, the rock faces were not cold. They were not warm either, not like a stove. They were just even. The rock held a memory. Whatever heat had ever touched it, it did not give up easy. The deeper you went, the more it held. Earth was the longest memory there was. She had thought it was poetry. She had filed it the way you file a husband's characteristic way of making the ordinary sound significant with affection and the slight condescension of the person who did not share the obsession. She had not thought of it as engineering. She stood up and walked to the back wall. She pressed both palms flat against the cold stone surface at the base of the wall, where the foundation logs met the granite of the hillside. Cold on the surface, yes, with the chill that winter-adjacent air had laid over the outermost layer of rock. But beneath that surface cold, she thought she could feel something deeper, a thermal mass so enormous that the winter had not yet reached its center, would not reach its center, could not, with all its fury, penetrate to the core of something that had been accumulating the Earth's interior heat for longer than people had been on this continent. She thought, what if the fire did not heat the air? What if the fire heated the stone? Her hand was still on the wall. She walked to the hearth and looked at it. The great open maw of it, the back wall of the firebox, and behind that back wall, 8 feet of packed earth and clay, before the granite mass of the hill began in earnest. She took the land deed from its place on the shelf, the most important document she owned, and turned it over and began to draw on the back of it, because it was the only paper large enough. And she had stopped worrying sometime recently about which of her possessions were too precious for utility. The firebox first, but not this firebox, a different one. Small, tall, insulated, designed for a fast and ferociously hot combustion. The kind of heat that burned the volatile gases in the smoke before they could leave as waste. Then a horizontal channel from the back of that firebox running through the packed earth of the hillside 40 feet into the granite mass. The channel lined with flat stone, 2 feet wide, 3 feet high, tight enough to keep the gases in contact with the walls, not so tight as to choke the flow. At the far end of the channel, a vertical shaft rising 20 feet through the hill and exiting on the slope above as a simple stone chimney barely visible from the cabin below. The hot gas from the fire would have no choice but to travel the tunnel, and as it traveled, it would pay. Every inch of that 40-foot journey, the superheated exhaust would surrender its energy to the stone walls of the channel, to the clay of the hillside, to the granite above and below. By the time the gas reached the vertical chimney, it would be cooled, stripped of the vast majority of its thermal value. But it would still be warmer than the outside air enough to create the suction that would pull the next rush of gas from the firebox behind it, maintaining the flow, preventing back pressure, keeping the system breathing. And the stone would remember, tons of granite and clay and packed earth slowly filling with heat, the way a cistern fills with water, degree by degree, hour by hour. Not releasing it fast, that was not what stone did. Stone was not a radiator. Stone was a vault. It would give back what it had been given slowly, steadily, for hours after the fire had gone cold. The floor of the cabin, the back wall, the very foundation under their feet. They would all become part of the heating system. Not heating the air, which was the most faithless substance in nature, which changed temperature the moment a door opened or a crack breathed cold. Heating the mass, heating the house itself from within. She stood over the drawing for a long time. Then she sat down and ran the arithmetic again, this time with different numbers. A firebox 1/4 the size of the current hearth, burning hot and clean twice a day for an hour. Wood consumption perhaps a 1/4 cord per month, perhaps less, once the thermal mass had absorbed its initial charge. Against 2 cord of fuel, against a 90-day winter. The numbers held. They more than held. She folded the land deed carefully and put it inside her dress against her skin, where it would stay until she needed it again. She began the following morning, not with the tunnel, which was weeks away, and required the hearth to be dismantled first and a plan confirmed. She began with observation, with the methodology of someone who had grown up watching a man never touch a wall until he understood what was on the other side. She walked the perimeter of the granite hill every morning for 3 days, tapping the rock face with the butt of Caleb's pickaxe, listening to the sound the way a doctor listens to a chest. She was looking for the softer zones, the clay intrusions, the places where the geology had left a seam that would reward the effort. She found two. The more promising was directly behind the back wall of the cabin, angled slightly upward from horizontal, which would help the draw. She told no one. She was not ready to translate the drawing on the land deed into language that would survive the open air of other people's certainty. The work of dismantling the old hearth began in the 3rd week of August, and it was not quiet work. Stone is not quiet. She wrapped the largest pieces in her second blanket to muffle the impact when they hit the floor, and still the sound carried. And Owen abandoned his post at the water barrel, where she had stationed him, and appeared in the doorway asking nothing, only watching, which was a more complete form of attention than any question he could have asked. The hearth opened up to her over 2 days. The stones were massive but mortared loosely, and the mortar was old enough to have given up its original ambition. She worked carefully around the throat of the existing flue, leaving that structure intact for the moment. She would seal it last when the new system was ready to carry the load. What she exposed finally was the raw back wall of the firebox, packed clay and fieldstone, and behind it, the beginning of the hillside itself. She pressed her palm against it in the dark interior of the opened hearth. Cold clay, the smell of deep earth, mineral and time. The smell of Caleb's work clothes after a long shift. And then she did not think about that again, because there was too much to do. She had the hole in the back of the hearth, and the first tool marks in the hillside clay when Silas Croft arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. He came alone, which she understood was a form of consideration, giving her the dignity of this conversation without an audience. He stood at the edge of her work, his thumbs at rest at his sides rather than in his suspenders, a sign that he was being more careful than usual. He looked at the opened hearth, the mound of removed stone, the beginning of the hole in the hillside, perhaps 18 inches deep at that point. He spoke her name with the register of someone who had decided on patience as a strategy, and she set down the pickaxe and straightened, pushing the back of her wrist against her forehead. She was covered in clay dust, and her arms were shaking slightly from 2 days of impact work. She told him plainly she was building a new hearth. He told her that what he was looking at was not a hearth, that it was a hole in the side of a hill. She explained the full system to him. The channel, the 40-foot run, the vertical chimney on the slope, the thermal mass of the hill, absorbing the heat as the exhaust traveled through. She watched him process it. She could see the exact moment the processing hit the wall of his professional identity. Because beyond a certain point, Engaging seriously with her argument required him to entertain the possibility that he had been building the wrong way for 11 years. And that was a room he was not prepared to enter. He told her the smoke would not travel 40 feet on a horizontal path, that it lacked the energy that the draw from a vertical chimney 40 feet removed from the firebox would be insufficient to overcome the friction and the distance. He told her the gas would stall, would back pressure into the firebox would come into the room. He said she and the boy would not wake up. She told him the chimney height created the draw that 20 feet of vertical height on a column of gas warmer than the outside air produced a pressure differential sufficient to pull exhaust through a channel of this diameter, that the geometry worked and she had run the
This
arithmetic.
mark is
He
the
told
key.
her he had been building
How
in
can
this
you be
territory
sure?
for 11 years
I've seen this
and had built
before.
31
dig.
structures that had survived Dakota winters, and he had never once seen a horizontal flue of this length function correctly, and the physics did not support it. She held his gaze and told him the physics supported it exactly. The hot gas was less dense than the cold air in the tunnel. It wanted to rise. The vertical chimney at the end gave it a place to rise to. The pressure differential that created would pull the gas through the horizontal channel. The gas did not need to push it, only needed to be pulled. On its way through, it surrendered its heat to the stone walls. By the time it reached the base of the chimney, it had lost most of its thermal energy but was still buoyant enough to rise. The system breathed continuously as long as any temperature differential existed at all. She watched him work through it and watched the working through hit the wall, and she recognized the expression that settled on his face afterward. The expression of a man who had decided the discussion was over, because the alternative required him to question things he had not yet agreed to question. He told her he could not in good conscience allow her to risk her son's life on an untested theory. He said he would send 2 men the next morning to rebuild the firebox to a proper specification. He told her there was no obligation, that this was what neighbors did. The offer was genuine. It was also the most complete expression of the problem she faced. He was trying to fold her situation back into a framework he controlled, where outcomes were predictable because he had built all the structures and all the structures worked according to his principles. Accepting his help meant accepting his understanding of what was possible. It meant the hole in her hillside would be filled in. It meant 32 days of fuel against 90 days of winter and a prayer for a mild season. She thanked him. She told him she would not need the men. He held her gaze for a moment, and what she saw in his face was not anger, but something closer to the expression of a man watching a boat push away from a dock, knowing the water ahead was bad and being unable to stop the departure. He nodded, once picked up his hat from the porch rail, and walked back toward the road without another word. She watched him go. Then she picked up the pickaxe and went back into the hillside. By the next morning, Hattie Pruitt was at the general store before the door was fully open, and by noon the settlement had its understanding of the situation. A woman alone, grief-addled, digging up her own foundation instead of stacking wood, had refused the help of the most qualified builder in the territory. The consensus formed with the speed of something that had been waiting to form. She was lost to her own stubbornness. And whatever came of it in January was the natural consequence of a decision made in August. And the community had offered and been refused and could do no more. Mara knew this was happening. She had lived among people long enough to understand how information moved and what shape it took as it moved. She registered the shifted glances at the store, the conversations that stopped a beat too late when she entered the church. She noted it the way she noted the failing chinking and the insufficient woodpile as a fact to be incorporated into the actual conditions of her situation. If her system failed, no one was coming. That was the sharpened edge of the decision she had made when she turned down Croft's offer, and she held it in her mind clearly and without illusion, because the alternative was how people died out here. There was also beneath the fear something she did not yet have a name for. A kind of clean, exposed aliveness that came from having reduced the situation to its actual components. No goodwill buffer, no safety net of community generosity, just the arithmetic on the land deed, the pickaxe, the hill, and Owen. And Caleb's voice, not as grief, not as consolation, but as instruction. The rock holds a memory. The deeper you go, the more it holds. She went deeper. The tunnel entered September with her. By the 1st of September, she had 14 feet of channel cut and lined the flat creek stones, set with a precision that surprised her. Each one fitted to its neighbor with the patience of someone who understood that every gap was a place where heat would leak and be lost before it reached the stone that needed it. Owen had developed a stone classification system without being asked. Flat stones in one pile, rounded in another, irregular in a third. And he applied it with the seriousness of someone who had decided that the quality of the raw material was his personal responsibility. She had not told him to do this. She had simply found the piles one morning and understood that he was solving a problem she had not yet articulated to him, which was exactly what Caleb used to do. And she had to stand with her back to Owen for a minute before she could speak normally again. The work had settled into a physical logic, mourning the hard excavation when her muscles were fresh enough to drive the pickaxe properly. Midday, the lining work fitting the channel stones, while the tunnel was lit by the angle of the sun coming through the entrance. Evening, the assessment, running her hands along the day's progress in the lamplight, checking for weak sections, feeling for the places where the clay walls had a different texture that might signal a problem underground. She had stopped thinking of the work as difficult. Difficult was a category that implied comparison to an easier alternative, and she had no easier alternative, so the word had become meaningless and fallen away. The first full week of September brought Croft back, though not in person. His presence arrived through intermediaries first. Thomas Aldrich, who ran the livery, and had the blunt social manner of someone who genuinely did not understand that delivering a message and delivering a judgment were different activities. He stopped his wagon at the end of her property line and called out that he had heard she was still digging. Was that right? And had she considered that a tunnel under a structure could compromise the foundation? Because Croft had mentioned that the foundation issue. She was at the tunnel entrance when he said this, covered in clay to the elbows. And she told him the tunnel did not run under the cabin, but into the hill behind it, which was granite and had not moved in approximately 10 million years, and was unlikely to begin on her account. Aldrich nodded, uncertain, and drove on. 3 days later, Hattie Pruitt came in person, and Hattie was a different instrument entirely. She arrived with cornbread still warm, which was a genuine kindness, and Mara received it as such. They sat on the porch in the mid-September warmth, with the aspen color just beginning at the upper elevations, and for perhaps 4 minutes they discussed the cornbread and the coming season and the state of the road to the store. Then Hattie set her hands in her lap and told Mara that people were worried, not just Silas, everyone that they were saying. She had maybe 2 coats stacked and was spending her days digging instead of cutting. Mara told her the digging was the preparation, that the tunnel reduced what the fire needed to do, that a smaller fire burning efficiently and heating a thermal mass instead of open air brought the fuel requirement down to a fraction of what a conventional hearth demanded. She said she had enough wood. Hattie looked at her with the expression of someone weighing the distance between what a person was saying and what the person could see about their own situation. She said gently that Caleb had been a good man. Mara understood exactly what was being offered, the explanation for her behavior available to her if she wanted it. Grief dislocation, a foreign idea being applied to conditions it wasn't suited to. All she had to do was receive it, and the community would metabolize her tunnel as a symptom of loss rather than a threat to their sense of order. She told Hattie he was, and that he had taught her how to listen to what the earth holds, and that she was using what he had taught her. Hattie left the way Croft had left, without visible anger, with something more difficult, the composed expression of someone who had done what they could and was releasing the outcome. The social isolation was now complete, and Mara registered this with the same cold clarity she brought to everything. She carried it into the tunnel with her the next morning, and the morning after that, and she used it the way she used her fear, as a clarifier. A thing that burned away everything except the essential question: did the system work or did it not? The work entered its most demanding stretch in the 5th week. At 22 feet, the clay composition changed a denser layer, blue-gray and reluctant, that took 3 times the effort to move as the reddish clay of the outer sections. Her progress dropped from 2 feet per day to 8 inches. She began rationing her approach, driving the dense clay in the mornings when she was strongest and switching to lining work in the tunnel's earlier sections in the afternoons, where visible progress kept the day from feeling like an argument she was losing. Owen had begun in the evenings to read aloud from their single book, while she worked on the lining, his voice carrying into the tunnel from his position at the entrance, bouncing off the stone walls in a way that made it seem to come from inside the rock itself. She never asked him to do this. He had simply decided that the dark required a counterweight and that his voice was the available tool. She worked by lamplight with his reading flowing over her, and felt in those hours that the tunnel was not a place of isolation, but of a particular kind of company, the company of someone who trusted completely and required nothing in return. It was at 26 feet a night in early October, her hands moving across the channel wall on a routine check, that the real doubt arrived. Not the surface doubt she managed daily, the question of the draw and the thermal transfer rate, but something deeper, something below the engineering. She had followed a dead man's voice into a hillside and was now alone in the dark, wondering whether she had confused love with instruction. Caleb had known coal. He had known deep shafts and hard faces and the patience of stone. He had not known this specific system, had never drawn this specific diagram. She had assembled his words into a blueprint he had never seen. What if the assembly was wrong? What if the thing she was building was not a synthesis of his knowledge, but a monument to her need to use it? Owen's voice reached her through the rock. He was reading about a man who had miscalculated a river crossing and stood in the current, deciding whether to go forward or back. And the book's position was that neither direction was obviously safer, and the decision would define the man regardless of outcome. She pressed her back against the tunnel wall and sat in the dark. Then she thought about the arithmetic. Not Caleb's voice, not the memory of his hands, not love in any of its forms, just the numbers. The chimney height, the temperature differential, the draw coefficient. She ran it again in her head as she had run it on the land deed, and every subsequent night when she needed to check the foundation. The numbers came out the same. They had always come out the same. Whatever she felt about Caleb, whatever she feared about her own judgment, the numbers did not change because she was afraid. Physics was not sentimental. It did not care about her grief or her isolation. The pressure differential was real. The draw would work. She got up and went back to the face. The hard clay layer broke on the 4th day of the battle, with it not all at once, but in the way that difficult things often broke, a gradual change in the sound of the pickaxe, a slightly different texture. And then a section that came loose in one piece, a slab the size of a door, and Owen hauled it out in sections. And on the other side, the clay was red-brown again, soft again, and she could breathe. At 25 feet, she hit the granite intrusion. She knew what it was before the lamp confirmed it, because the pickaxe told her first, not the solid resistance of dense clay, but something absolute, a non-negotiation, the tool bouncing back with a shock that ran through her wrists and into her shoulders. She brought the lamp forward. A wall of pale gray granite streaked with quartz cut directly across the path of the tunnel at a slight diagonal. Not a boulder she could root around. A continuation of the main geological formation, a root of the mass she was trying to thread her channel through. She sat with it for the rest of that day, and through the night and into the next morning. The block could not be broken out. The vibration of serious impact work would compromise the shoring above it. She could not go over it without losing the horizontal gradient the draw depended on. She could not go significantly under it without dropping the floor of the channel below the level of the firebox outlet. She went back to what Caleb had described of hard face work in the Pennsylvania mines. Not the breaking, but the finding. Every face had a line of least resistance, a direction in which the rock preferred to separate if given the choice. You did not attack the face. You listened to it until it told you where its edge was. She spent 2 days with her hands on the granite, moving the lamp across its surface at different angles, feeling for the differential in texture that indicated a seam or a fracture line. She found it on the second day, a diagonal trace running from lower left to upper right, a hairline separation between two layers where different mineral compositions had cooled at different rates, leaving a plane of weakness invisible to the eye but legible to the fingertip. The adjustment was 12 degrees off the original line. She would angle the channel to the right, running along the natural fault in the granite, then curve back to the original heading once she was clear. It would add 4 feet to the total length and create a gradual bend in the channel. She stared at the adjusted geometry in her mind before she allowed herself to see what she had initially read as a setback. The bend increased the contact surface between the gas and the tunnel walls. More contact surface meant more heat transfer. The obstacle handled correctly was not neutral. It was an improvement. She began the angled section with a different quality of attention, less driving forward, and more the careful work of someone reading a surface while they cut it, feeling the granite respond along its natural fault. 4 days through the angled section, 3 more to curve back to heading, and she was past the obstruction with the channel intact and the ceiling shoring untouched. 29 feet, 11 remaining. The aspens at the upper elevations had turned fully, and the nights were cold enough to see her breath in the tunnel entrance each morning. She built the vertical shaft in the last week of October, working from the surface down once the horizontal channel was complete, digging through 20 feet of hillside from above to meet the far end of the tunnel. The moment the two channels connected, the moment the final section of surface shaft broke through the ceiling of the horizontal run, the lamp flame in the tunnel below flickered and steadied and then bent perceptibly toward the new opening above. She held very still and watched that flame for a full minute. It was bending toward the draft. There was a draft. The pressure differential was real before a single fire had been lit. She rebuilt the firebox in the first days of November. Small told the combustion chamber lined with dense flat stones designed to reflect heat back into the burn zone to produce a blaze hot enough to combust the volatile gases before they could leave as waste. She sealed the old chimney flue with rock and clay packed in 3 successive layers. The act of sealing it was irreversible in a way that the tunnel was not a sealed flue, could not be easily unsealed. And everyone who saw it would understand that she had committed completely. She was telling the physics to deliver. The first fire went in on a Wednesday evening in the second week of November, when the temperature outside had dropped to 12 degrees and the ground had turned to iron. She built the fire, small and specific dry wood split fine, the pieces arranged to maximize surface area, and heat quickly to the temperature, where combustion became self-sustaining. Owen sat on the floor behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. The fire caught and climbed fast, the narrow firebox channeling the combustion upward, and the sound it made was different from any fire she had heard in a conventional hearth. Cleaner, higher, a focused roar rather than the sprawling crackle of an open fire. She watched the throat of the channel at the back of the firebox. The smoke moved. It did not billow back. It moved forward into the channel and kept moving, and the lamp she had placed at the tunnel entrance 30 feet away showed its flame bending toward the hill, toward the draw pulling the exhaust through the earth. 20 minutes passed, 30. The firebox temperature built steadily. An hour in, she let the fire die to a self-sustaining level and sat back on her heels and put both palms flat on the floor. The floor was not yet warm. She had known it would not be. The thermal mass needed time, needed repeated charging, needed to reach a temperature above ambient before it would begin to return heat rather than simply absorb it. The system was a bank, and the bank needed deposits before it made withdrawals. This was the part that required a different kind of faith. Not the faith that the physics was correct, but the patience to wait while the physics did its slow work. Owen was asleep when she finally noticed sometime past midnight that the floor under her hand had changed. Not dramatically, just less cold. The neutrality of a surface that had stopped conducting away and begun barely to hold. She pressed her palm harder against the floorboard. then moved her hand 12 inches and pressed again. The same. Not her hand's warmth bleeding into the wood, the floor itself. She did not wake Owen. She sat alone in the banked fire dark and let herself understand what she had done. Outside, the temperature was dropping past zero. The wind was moving through the settlement, testing structures, finding the weak joints, doing what it had always done. In here, in this space, the world had already written off. The earth was beginning to remember. The floor was warm. By morning, it would be warmer. By the third day of regular firing, it would be a stable, radiating presence, a quiet fact of the cabin that required no maintenance, no tending, no feeding with the desperate hunger of a conventional hearth. Hattie Pruitt, who came in the second week of December, ostensibly to return a borrowed pan, stood inside the door for 30 seconds without saying anything, which was the longest Mara had ever seen her. Without words, her face doing the arithmetic that a certainty had previously prevented her from running. She left without asking any questions.
This mark
She
is the
had the
key.
expression of a woman
How
who would
can
be
you be
asking
sure?
them later privately.
I've seen this
after the
before.
evidence
Then
had
we
finished
dig.
rearranging itself into something she could articulate. Mara had fired the system twice daily since November, and by the time December ended, the thermal mass of the hill had reached what she thought of as its operational charge. The floor was consistently warmer than the air a foot above it. The back wall radiated a steady, gentle heat at all hours. Owen slept without his second blanket. He had started sleeping without his socks. Outside, January arrived without negotiation. It did not build toward itself the way cold usually did, with a week of progressive warnings. It simply came overnight, between a Tuesday and a Wednesday, dropping the world below zero and keeping it there with the fixed intention of something that had decided. The settlers who had been in the territory long enough called it a blue stillness, not for the color of the sky, which was in fact a hard-scoured white, but for the quality of the air itself, a density and clarity that had something almost mineral about it, as if the cold had purified everything down to its essential structure and left only the irreducible fact standing. The trees confirmed it before dawn. From inside the cabin, Mara heard the first one, a sound like a rifle shot somewhere in the upper timber. Then another closer. Then a series of them, in the early dark, the frozen sap in the pines, expanding past the wood's tolerance, the trunks splitting along their grain, with a violence that the silence around it made more alarming, not less. Owen woke at the third one and lay still in his blankets listening. She told him what it was and he nodded and lay back down. And she thought, he is a child who has learned that most sudden loud noises in the dark are nature rather than disaster, and she was not certain whether this was a form of toughness or a form of loss. The thermometer she had nailed to the north-facing exterior wall read 38 below zero at first light. By mid-morning, it had not moved. She lit the morning fire with the particular economy she had developed over 6 weeks of operating the system, dry splits of pine no longer than her forearm arranged in a loose pyramid over a base of shaved kindling. The combustion chamber drawing hard from its first breath. She had learned to read the sound of the firebox the way she had learned to read the tunnel walls. There was a pitch the fire reached when it was burning at maximum efficiency. A high-focused note that meant the combustion was complete, the gases consumed in the firebox rather than pushed into the channel as waste. When she heard that note, she fed the fire once more and left it alone. Outside, the settlement was conducting a different relationship with January entirely. Silas Croft had been burning wood since October, at a rate calibrated for a serious but survivable winter. What arrived in January was not that winter. What arrived exposed the fundamental flaw in a system designed for average conditions. It had no tolerance for the extreme. His woodpile, which had seemed adequate against a normal season, was revealing itself against this one as a quantity that would run out. The mathematics were brutal and simple. His hearth's consumption rate against his remaining supply produced a date, and the date was not in spring. He moved through December with controlled urgency, rationing the fires, keeping the main room at a temperature that was survivable rather than comfortable, watching his family compress their lives into a smaller and smaller thermal circle around the hearth. His youngest daughter Sarah had begun coughing in the third week of December. A dry cough at first, the kind that cold air produced in any child, and he had told himself it was the kind. But by the second week of January, with the temperature locked at 38 below, and the cabin losing the battle for warmth degree by degree, the cough had changed. It had gone deeper, found a different register, and his wife Margaret had stopped pretending she was not counting the days since it started. Croft had been a man of systems his whole life. His systems were tested and proven and had served the community well for 11 years. He was not a man who questioned his systems because his systems had never in 11 years given him serious reason to. What January had done, what the blue stillness had accomplished in 2 weeks of sustained assault, was not just the consumption of his woodpile. It had done something more fundamental. It had introduced him for the first time in his professional life to the experience of being wrong in a way that had consequences he could not fix with his hands. He sat on the 17th day of the freeze and burned the last of a side table he had built himself from oak he had milled in the autumn of 1879 and watched the fire take it and thought about Mara Holt. He had thought about her periodically since September, with the regularity of a man returning to an argument he had not fully answered. He told himself he returned because the safety concern was genuine. He had not permitted himself to think about it from the other direction, from the possibility that the system worked, because that direction led somewhere he had not been willing to go. On the 17th day, with the oak table burning, and Sarah coughing in the back room, and Margaret's face carrying the specific stillness of a woman who had stopped asking her husband to fix things he could not fix, Croft went in that direction. If the system worked, if the tunnel carried heat, if the thermal mass held it, if the draw functioned as she had described, then Mara Holt and her son had been warm for 2 months on a fraction of the fuel he had consumed. They had not been surviving, they had been living. While he built fortresses against the cold, she had made a covenant with it, and the covenant was holding. He told himself that what he was going to do was check on the widow's place, that she might need assistance. He did not correct the other thought running beneath it, which was that 2 people had been living alone on a fraction of a cord of wood in a Dakota winter, and by now almost certainly had not survived, and their fuel supply was still there. And his daughter was sick, and these were the facts of the situation, and practical men responded to facts. He had enough honesty to know what he was doing. He did not have enough yet to name it differently. The 100 yards between his property and Mara's took 12 minutes in the 38 below air. The cold at that temperature did not feel like cold in the conventional sense. It was a presence, something with mass and intention, something that pushed back when you moved through it. The snow under his boots made no soft compression. It spoke in a dry, high squeak, the sound of moisture so completely frozen, it had lost the capacity for give. He had his face wrapped to the eyes, and still the cold found the skin around his lashes and made its point. He approached from the front and catalogued automatically roof intact, walls upright. No structural failure visible from the perimeter. The window showed no lamp. He looked for the chimney. The main chimney was cold. No smoke, no heat shimmer above the cap, nothing rising. He stopped. Then he looked at the hill. 40 feet behind the cabin on the slope above the tunnel's exit point, a thin column of white rose from a stone cap set flush with the hillside. Pale, clean, barely distinguishable from the frozen air around it. Not the dark, billowing smoke of a desperate fire, but the minimal exhaust of a system running at efficiency, releasing only what it could not use. It was the signature of a fire that had already given most of its heat to something else before being allowed to leave. He stood in the snow and looked at it for a long time. Then he walked to the cabin door and knocked. The wait was perhaps 20 seconds long enough that he had begun to reconfigure his thinking, to prepare for no answer. Then the bar on the inside scraped back, and the door opened, and Mara Holt stood in the frame wearing her work dress, the gray wool one, and her expression was the expression of someone who had opened a door, expecting a neighbor, and found something more complicated. Behind her, Owen sat on the floor near the back wall, not compressed into the smallest warm space, the way a child in a cold cabin positioned himself, but in the middle of the room with his carved wooden pieces arranged in front of him. And he looked up at the knock and then went back to his arrangement. He was in his shirt. The heat came through the open door and reached Croft's face before he stepped inside, and it stopped him on the threshold. Not because it was fierce. It was not fierce, not the aggressive, radiant punch of a stoked conventional fire. It was pervasive. It came from everywhere and nowhere, the undifferentiated warmth of a space that had been thoroughly heated at the level of its structure, the air and the walls and the floor, all contributing equally to a temperature that was simply stable. Inhabited, the temperature of a place where people were living rather than enduring. He stepped inside. His eyes went immediately to the firebox. A bed of coals, orange and quiet, banked to minimal combustion. No open flame, no roaring performance. A fire that had already done its primary work and was idling. He breathed in deliberately. Clean air, the faint, dry smell of pine combustion fully completed the smell of a fire that had consumed itself properly. He crossed to the back wall without speaking and put his bare hand against the stone. The warmth entered his palm with the particular quality of mass-held heat. Not the surface warmth of a fire-facing stone, but the deep, even temperature of something that had been absorbing energy for weeks, that had so thoroughly incorporated the heat that the heat was no longer on it, but in it. He pressed harder, as if he could measure the depth of the warmth. He could feel it past the surface, past the first inch of stone. It went down. He crouched and put his hand on the floor. The floorboards were warm. Not hot, not the searing warmth of a floor with a fire directly beneath it, but the settled, reliable warmth of a floor that had been warm for weeks and intended to remain so. He moved his hand 2 feet to the left, warm, 2 feet to the right, the same. He sat down on the floor. Not in a chair on the floor, because his legs had made a decision before his mind had the decision that this was a moment that required him at the level of the evidence close to the thing he had been wrong about. He looked at Mara. All his strength, all his knowledge, 31 structures standing in the snow around them, as monuments to what he understood, and none of it had produced what she had produced with a pickaxe, a lamp, and whatever her husband had told her in Pennsylvania about the memory of stone. One word came out of him, stripped of every construction he would normally have built around it. How? She looked at him for a moment. Then she knelt and took a piece of charcoal from the hearth bucket and drew on the warm floor between them. The firebox, first, its height, its insulated geometry, its design for complete combustion. Then the channel, the horizontal run, the gradual upward angle, the lined stone walls. Her hand moved with the confidence of someone drawing something they had drawn 10,000 times in their mind. The bend where the granite intrusion had forced the adjustment, and she drew that with particular care, noting the increased surface area, the accident of the obstacle that had become a feature. Then the vertical shaft, the chimney on the hill. She told him to make the fire burn fast and clean so it consumed its own smoke. She told him to make the heat walk a long road before letting it go, and on that road to collect a tollstone and clay and earth, taking what the hot gas offered and keeping it. The earth, she said, did not release heat quickly, and that was the whole point. What it took in it gave back slowly, steadily for hours after the fire was gone. Stop heating the air and start heating the house. The house becomes the heater. He looked at the drawing on the warm floor. The geometry was simple. The principle was simple. He had built 31 structures without ever questioning whether the direction heat should travel was up. And the answer was apparently not necessarily not when you had a hill and the patience to open a conversation with it. He said 31 houses and let the number sit between them. She told him 31 houses had kept a lot of families alive. He said not warm, and she told him that alive was where you started. She stood and went to her woodpile and pulled a bundle of splits from it. Her woodpile, which was diminished but intact, which had run more than 2 months at twice daily firings and still had fuel remaining. She set the bundle near the door. Then she went to the shelf beside the window and took down a piece of flat bark she had kept there. She took the charcoal and transferred the drawing from the floor to the bark. The firebox, the channel, the bend, the vertical shaft, adding dimensions beside each element in her neat hand. Noting the stone specification for the channel lining the optimal firebox proportions the minimum chimney height required for adequate draw, she handed it to him. He looked at the bark drawing. He looked at the bundle of wood. He looked at Owen, who had not stopped arranging his pieces during any of this, conducting the private business of childhood, with the self-contained focus of a boy who understood the adults were doing something important, and that the best contribution he could make was to not interrupt it. At the door, Croft stopped without turning around. He said he had been building the wrong thing for 11 years, and the sentence came out with the weight of a man setting down something he had been carrying a long distance. She told him he had been building the best thing he knew how to build, and that now he knew how to build a better one. He went out into the blue stillness with the drawing against his chest and the bundle of wood under his arm, and the 12-minute walk back through the killing cold ahead of him. Halfway there, he stopped and looked up at the sky, that hard-scoured white sky with no give in it. And he understood something he had not understood before. She had not beaten the winter. She had stopped fighting it. The winter was unchanged, as brutal and indifferent as it had always been. What had changed was the terms of engagement, and the terms had changed because she had refused to accept that the only available strategy was the one everyone else was using. At his own cabin, he built the smallest fire he had built all winter. 2 splits from the bundle positioned his remaining furniture against the back wall, on the instinct that the back wall was where a channel, if he had one, would make itself felt. The fire was inadequate by every standard he had previously used, and yet Sarah, who had been shivering for 4 days under 2 blankets, stopped shivering by midnight. He sat up and watched her breathing level and slow into genuine sleep, and he held the bark drawing in his hands in the dark and began to plan. He came back when the freeze broke. March the first week, the temperature lifting past 0, and then past 10, and then on a Thursday past freezing, for the first time since December. He came with his tools and with the humility of a skilled man approaching a skill he did not yet have. Not the humility of a man diminished, but the humility of a man who had identified the precise nature of his gap and intended to close it. They worked through March and into April. Croft brought his knowledge of stone and structure, the load-bearing calculations, the proper preparation of fired clay tile for a channel that would outlast both of them, the correct way to key the vertical shaft into the hillside without creating a frost heave vulnerability that would shift the chimney in 5 years. Mara brought the system's internal logic, the geometry of the channel relative to firebox height, the relationship between tunnel length and chimney height that maintained adequate draw across the range of temperatures. The territory produced the method for charging the thermal mass at the start of a season and reading its output in the daily temperature of the floor. They found working together that each carried something the other had needed without knowing. His experience with local stone identified which formations would hold heat most efficiently. The dense dark basalt outcroppings held twice the thermal capacity of lighter granite per unit of volume, a fact she had not had the geological range to discover. Her understanding of the channel's internal physics identified a design modification he had been instinctively drawn to, but unable to justify a slight narrowing at the firebox throat that increased gas velocity in the first section of the channel, improving heat transfer in the zone where the temperature differential was greatest. The first installation they did together was at the Aldrich Livery, which suffered from a cold problem more serious than any residence because of its volume and the expense of heating it through winter. The system they installed was larger than Mara's original 60 feet of channel, running into a basalt formation on the north side of the property, and it worked so completely that Aldrich stood in his livery on the first cold night of the following autumn and said nothing for a long time, and then said only that it kept going after the fire went out, which was the essential experience, the one no description fully prepared a person for the discovery that heat could be stored in the structure of a place and returned without a flame. The name came from Aldrich. He asked what to call it when his neighbor came to look, and asked the same question Croft had asked, standing with a hand on a warm wall in the dark. Croft looked at Mara. She shook her head. She had the system. The system was sufficient. Croft said, Holt Hearth. And the name traveled with the design attached to it the way names attach to things that work, because people needed something to ask for, and the asking required a name. 7 cabins by the end of that first shared spring, 12 by the following autumn. The design moved through the settlement. Not the way fashions moved with the enthusiasm of novelty, but the way knowledge moved with the steadiness of something that addressed a real problem and addressed it completely. Each installation was slightly different. Different geology, different structure, different dimensions. But the principle was the same in everyone. The same conversation between fire and stone, the same long road for the heat, the same collection of the tall. Croft told the story himself, which was the thing that made it travel. He told it at the store and at the church, and when neighboring settlers came asking about the design. And he told it with the particular authority of someone who had been wrong in public and chosen to make that wrongness part of the record, rather than edit it away. He said he had told her the smoke would not make the journey, that the physics did not support it, and that he had been wrong in the most expensive way a person could be wrong. Not wrong about a number or a date, but wrong about what was possible and wrong, because he had confused his experience with the boundary of what existed. He said it every time. He did not soften it. The complete account of his error was he understood the most important part of the instruction, because the error was not his alone. They had all built the same way for the same reason, because it was the way building had been done. Mara had examined another method. The method worked. The winter that followed Mara's third in the territory came in hard and stayed. In the Holt Hearth cabins, people were not merely surviving. They were present at their own lives, working, thinking, planning, reading to their children in the evenings, conducting the interior life that distinguishing surviving from living required a reliable temperature to sustain. In a winter that matched or exceeded the worst on record, the settlement's mortality from exposure was 0. Owen turned 8 in April and had been for 2 months accompanying Croft to new installations as an unofficial apprentice, handing stone, watching the channel work take shape, already asking questions that indicated he was thinking about the system not as a fixed design, but as a set of principles that could be applied in different configurations. He had his father's instinct for the thing beneath the thing, for the question that opened the next door. He would be a builder, not of the kind that built against the world, but of the kind that built with it. One afternoon in late May, Mara climbed the hill behind the cabin to the point where the chimney cap emerged from the slope. She sat beside it for a while, her hand on the warm stone. The system was not running now. The thermal mass had released its winter charge into the mild spring air. But the stone still held a residual warmth from months of use, a faint persisting memory of all the fires she had built below, the accumulated heat of an entire season stored and released and stored again. Across the valley, she could see the thin line of smoke from the Pruitt cabin's hillside chimney. Minimal pale, the signature of efficiency. Hattie had been the 5th installation, which Mara had noted with a satisfaction she had kept entirely to herself. The smoke from that hillside said that a family was warm at a cost that would not ruin them, that the earth was doing its slow, faithful work of holding what it had been given and offering it back. Owen came up the slope at the particular run of a boy who had decided somewhere below conscious thought that running was the correct speed for this distance and this afternoon. And he dropped down beside her and looked where she was looking at the far smoke line on the other hill. He asked what she was watching. She sat with the question for a moment, not because it was difficult, but because she wanted to answer it correctly, wanted to give it the weight it deserved. Below her, the cabin sat solid against the hill's base, the sealed chimney cap visible on the roof line. the hillside chimney beside her, quiet in the warm spring air. Somewhere in the stone around them, in the granite and clay and packed earth of the hill, the last of the season's stored heat was dissipating slowly into the warming ground, completing its transaction with the earth that had held it. The hill had kept its promise all winter, every day, without drama, without failure, without requiring anything except that she had understood what it was and what it could do. She thought of Caleb not with the acute grief of the first year, not even with the softened grief of the second, but with something that had become over the course of a winter and a spring and the work of her own hands, a form of continuation. He had known the principle. She had built the application. The knowledge had not died with him. It had moved through the earth and through her hands and into the stone walls of 12 cabins and the plans for 12 more, and it would keep moving for as long as people built in this territory and remembered what the ground beneath them was capable of. She told Owen she was watching the heat finish paying what it owed. He looked at the distant smoke for a moment, then at the cap beside them, then at her. He had his father's habit of sitting with a statement before responding, giving it the room it needed. Then he put his hand on the warm stone of the chimney cap, feeling the residual heat of a winter's worth of stored fire. And he nodded once and did not ask anything further, because that was exactly the right response. She put her hand beside his on the stone. The hill held its warmth the way it had always held warmth, the way it had been holding warmth since before anyone was here to notice it. Patient, reliable, indifferent to whether it was understood or not, but available, fully and completely available to anyone willing to stop fighting the ground beneath their feet and start listening to it instead. The world had told her to build a bigger fire. She had built a smarter one. The world had valued strength, and she had valued understanding. The world had looked to the sky, and she had looked to the earth. And the earth, that long and faithful memory, had kept every promise it had ever made to her. The earth remembered. It had always remembered. It had only been waiting for someone patient enough, desperate enough, clear-eyed enough to ask.